Decades after foreign banks left Somalia, the country has licensed 2 new foreign banks to operate in the country of about 15 million people. Is this the beginning of a new era for the country, which is struggling to find its way out from under a civil war? And we check in on 2 neighbors who are enjoying a profitable relationship. And later on, in Crypto Watch, cash no longer seems to be king. We'll be looking at the rise of digital currencies. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Let's start with African business headlines. The Kenya Revenue Authority, or KRA, has excluded Kenyans with personal and economic interests abroad from the mandatory payment of local tax, even if they stayed in the country for an entire income year. The Finance Act 2022, signed by President Uhuru Kenyatta, introduced a new definition of permanent home under the Income Tax Act, marking a relief to thousands of Kenyans long inconvenienced by tax demands of the authority. And staying in Kenya, the weekly Mombasa tax auction, or rather, tea auction in Kenya, held at the end of June, had 13 million kilograms of tea offered for sale. The amount on offer decreased from 13.5 million kilograms during the previous sale and from 13.6 million kilograms offered during a similar period last year. Of all the tea offered for sale, 9.8 million kilograms was sold, compared to 9.6 million kilograms during the previous sale and 11.9 million kilograms during the same period last year. The European Union and its development finance institutions will provide Nigeria with 1.29 billion euros, around $1.3 billion, to help Africa's most populous country diversify its economy away from oil. Nigeria has been trying to broaden its economy and exports outside the oil sector, which accounts for about 7% of Nigeria's gross domestic product and 90% of its foreign currency earnings. And gold dropped as U.S. Treasury yields rose and investors weighed the possible scrapping of some U.S. tariffs on Chinese consumer goods that could help ease inflation. The bullion fell as much as 0.5% in Asian trading after rising by a similar amount over the previous 2 sessions. President Joe Biden may announce a rollback of some levies as soon as this week. People familiar with the deliberations have said, although the timing could slip and a final decision might be made later than anticipated. Now, all foreign banks in Somalia were nationalized under the order of the Supreme Revolutionary Council in May 1970. Decades later, the country is reopening its financial sector to foreign banks. We'll get into the how, the why, and the who after the break. Now, in order to welcome foreign lenders into its struggling banking sector, Somalia has granted licenses to 2 foreign banks. Somalia is trying to recover from decades of civil war and an economy that has borne the brunt of the war. The governor of the Central Bank of Somalia, Abdurrahman Mohammed Abdullahi, said that the 2 banks chosen are both strong banks that will add value to the development of Somalia's financial sector and help the expansion of the economy. The approved foreign banks are Turkey's Ziraat Katalim and Egypt's state-owned Bank Misr. The nation of 15 million people, has at least 6 commercial banks, some of which provide services through the Hawala system, an unofficial network of money transfers carried out with in-person assurances. Somalia continues to rebuild economic governance institutions amid challenging circumstances. However, an incomplete political process and vulnerability to climate-related shocks could jeopardize the recovery from fragility. Now, joining me from Kenya is Ken Gichinga. He is the Chief Economist of Mentoria Economics, and we'll be looking at this situation in Somalia together. Ken, welcome to Business Edge once again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tolulope.
So it's been a bit difficult to estimate the volume and depth of Somalia's economy because of the circumstances surrounding security with Al-Shabaab and, of course, the civil war as well. But many have identified that it is a country with opportunities. So what kind of opportunities are we talking about?
You're absolutely spot on. Somalia has been blessed with a huge coastline. So the areas around fishing are quite prime. If you really think of livestock, it's a major player in the livestock market. And I think these are some of the economic activities that are starting to attract a lot of interest. And you'll remember there's also the issue of the possibilities of offshore gas. That has been a major issue between the Kenya and Somalia border. And definitely there will be banks that will be looking at the possibilities of financing the drilling of that offshore gas.
What do we think in terms of the urbanization of the country as well? Now, we've seen infrastructure taking a hit, and of course, we've seen immigration and migration because of the insecurity conversation happening in the country. But when it comes to the rapid urbanization, in spite of the war, what do we place that in terms of how it could help economic development?
Well, to be honest, the reality on the ground is Somalia's economy is fairly well organized informally. The Dahab network, which you alluded to earlier, really has a capability of moving capital from the big cities of London and New York to Africa within a matter of minutes. It's operated on a system of trust, but I think there is a deeper sense that Somalia needs to become bigger than that. It needs to now integrate with the global economy, and that's why the entry of these two banks, Banks Mystery and Zilat Katri, are really going to possibly become a game changer for the banking system in Somalia.
So let's talk about that banking system. So there's an informal system that works on trust, but beyond that, what's been the status? What's been the how and the way in which the banking system has operated in the recent years?
Well, it's difficult to get official statistics. Unlike most of the other economies, the Bureau of Statistics doesn't reveal much. But what we do know is that Somalia has a very significant diaspora in the States, in Europe, in countries such as Norway, here in Kenya. And by the way, here in Kenya, they've been extremely prosperous. So they do have, there is that entrepreneurial trait that has been part of both the diaspora. And I think now it's really a matter of how do you formalize those structures? How do you integrate them into the formal economy? And I do believe with a proper banking system, with the strengthening of monetary policy, Somalia can look different from what we're used to.
Very true. So we know that there has been some political turmoil, but the new leadership of Somalia, led by now President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, or Mahmoud, I beg your pardon, came into office on the back of promises to revive the economy in the midst of all this political turmoil that's been happening. Has there been any progress made, even no matter how incremental it might seem?
I think there has been progress on the economic sense. I think the political situation still remains fragile, but I think there has been a huge expansion on the economic side. As I said, that system of trust that connects citizens in Somalia to the greater diaspora, particularly here in Kenya, has seen a lot of wealth being generated here in Nairobi and back into Somalia. So I think that global integration, which you rarely see in other parts of Africa, I think has been particularly useful. But to your point, unless that political solution is found, it might be, this economic growth might actually be very fragile.
So now Somalia is opening back up 2 foreign banks, and they've chosen 2 of them. So let's look at what Somalia is looking for in these banks, or what Somalia could be expecting these banks to bring into the financial system.
Well, it really does feel like it's rolling back the years in terms of foreign banks playing in Somalia. This is at least 50 years since 1970, since when foreign banks were licensed to operate. When the Supreme Council came in after the revolution, most of the foreign banks that used to be there in the 60s, Italian banks, the British banks, they left. So this almost feels that it's been 50 years coming. And I do believe the character of these 2 banks, one is an Egyptian bank, so that could definitely be talking about Somalia's alignment with Egypt and also Turkey coming in also as a player. So I think it's not just a commercial play here, but it's also these two countries of Egypt and Turkey. They're saying they want to see more business in Somalia. So I think it's telling us that geopolitics is changing. Different countries are seeing Somalia from a different side, both geopolitically and economically. And if Somalia plays its cards very well, it might be in a place where it stands to gain both politically and both economically.
All right, Ken, we'll pause on that because we'd also want to see what the banks themselves feel that they may gain from entering into Somalia. But we'll also look at some of the things Somalia has done in the past 2 or 3 years to put itself on right footing with the international community as well as with those who could be looking to invest. So Ken, do hold on. When we come back, we'll look at Somalia's involvement in the heavily indebted poor countries initiative and also what Somalia has done in terms of paying off its debt to move towards opening up its financial systems once again. The conversation will continue right after this. Still with me is Ken Gichinga. He's the Chief Economist for Mentoria Economics. Now, let's look at some steps Somalia has taken in the past few years. The country reached the decision point of the heavily indebted poor countries initiative in March 2020, restoring the country's access to regular concessional financing and launching the process toward debt relief. It also cleared arrears to the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Development Association and reduced its external debt to $3.9 billion. On March 31st, 2020, Somalia reached agreements with the Paris Club on terms of debt relief and is also working with remaining creditors to reach similar agreements. Somalia is also servicing its outstanding debt to the AFDB and IDA. And to receive irrevocable debt relief, Somalia must maintain sound macroeconomic policies, implement its poverty reduction strategy as well. So, Ken, when you look at all the actions that Somalia has taken, and of course, I think we would also say the open arms in which the international community has also accepted some of the terms involved in these deals. Is Somalia really on the right track here?
I think when it comes to trying to integrate with the global economy, the answer to that would be yes. If you remember the Somalia of the early 90s, that was really almost banished from the international community. I remember those events. Particularly with the United States, around Black Hawk Down. So those are very huge, deep memories that really painted Somalia in a negative way. But that was about 30 years ago, and much appears to have changed. And I also feel like the global economy is seeing a lot in Somalia, particularly with what I mentioned earlier about the discovery of those natural offshore oil and gas reserves. If those estimates are close or even are to be believed, then Somalia could be sitting on immense wealth that the global community would like to be in contact with. So I think these new discoveries, particularly, and also its geographical, very strategic sector on segmentation on the maritime part of the Indian Ocean, I think it's putting Somalia in a very attractive way. So in a world where geopolitics is always changing, the narratives keep changing, but I believe the global community's interest in Somalia has been driven by new information and new insights.
So you did, of course, mention the alignments that Somalia has with Egypt, and then, of course, the geopolitical background that would inform Turkey and Egypt getting involved. But a bit more in terms of that, what do you think these foreign banking institutions can do for the economy? Why would they choose Somalia to be invested in?
I think possibly in their strategies, they have seen how the infrastructure on the Horn of Africa has been developing. As I said, Somalia has a huge coastline, and its ability to export huge commodities from bananas to livestock to oil and gas. I think banks, and these are banks that look for opportunities in any part of the world. So I think they see very virgin territory, very untapped potential. And they've seen also the Dahabshil network, how effective it has been in terms of remitting money. So in their perspective is, if that network can be put into the normal banking transfer network, that can also be a huge source of revenue. So I think it's studying the informal market and seeing the profits generated within those informal spaces and saying, why don't we try and bring these profits into the mainstream?
So beyond wanting to tap into the profits of this informal system, in terms of stimulating Somalia's economy, where do we think the benefits are going to lie the most? What sectors or industries do you think will have the most benefit from bringing these two banks on board?
I believe livestock will be a huge game changer. Somalia has both the conditions for providing livestock and the demand for livestock, particularly in the Middle East. Here in Kenya, we're exporting. We already have deals with countries like Oman, but the demand in the Middle East for livestock from East Africa, from Kenya, from Ethiopia, from Somalia is huge, that none of these individual countries can meet those demands individually. So I think Somalia will be playing into that. So the opportunities for export financing, trade financing, all these things into those countries have to be done by banks that have a very big balance sheet, because there are already banks existing in Somalia, 13 domestic banks, but I think what they're looking for now is banks that have the big balance sheets that can be able to provide trade financing solution, export solutions to those sectors. But I do believe that will be a huge sector. But also the oil and gas sector, I think if just the ordinary banter is anything to go by, there is a huge deposit that is only a matter of time before it stops. So I think between those two sectors, we might be able to see quite a bit of transformation.
So finally on this, when we look at these two banks coming in, 1970 was when all foreign banks were nationalized, and by that effect, all of them left the country. We heard from the Central Bank of Somalia governor saying that this has come after months of extensive conversations and documentation. Do you think this is just the beginning? How long will it just be these two foreign banks? When do we expect to see possibly more licenses granted? Or are we going to look at having these two banks dominate, at least for the next 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years as Somalia gradually reopens?
Well, I think a lot will depend on the pilot of these two banks. I think if the banking community sees success and sees sustainability and sees profit, then it is likely that more banks will apply, because banks are also hungry to lend, also looking for profit to make. Banks have a huge profit motive. So I think the possibility of observing those two banks, at least for a couple of years, will definitely form the foundation for a second wave of foreign banks entering Somalia.
All right, Ken, thank you so much. I'm not letting you go because we still have a conversation on how profitable Tanzania and Kenya's trade has become. And Ken will be joining us later on for that. But I know right now that Lekan Obanjo is standing by with the international business headlines. You're watching Business Edge. There's more coming up.
Welcome to International Business News. I am Lekan Obanjo, and we start by telling you that the EU's plan to label investments in gas and nuclear power plants as climate-friendly faces a final vote on Wednesday when European lawmakers decide whether to accept or reject proposals that have divided governments and investors. The vote is the final hurdle in the European Union's long-delayed decision on whether to add the two energy sources to its taxonomy, a rulebook determining which investments can be marketed in Europe as being sustainable. However, there is pressure from Ukraine not to label gas as a green asset. Recently, Ukraine's ambassador to Germany called on European lawmakers to reject the Commission's proposal, warning that it would benefit Russia and perpetuate European reliance on its gas supplies. Meanwhile, European stocks were mixed on Monday as investors settled into trading in the second half of the year following a brutal 6 months that were marred with worries over inflation, growth and the Ukraine war. The FTSE 100 surged 1.1%. France's CAC was 0.6% higher than the DAX, which fell 0.2% in Frankfurt. It came as Germany's dependence on Russian gas imports hit government balance sheets in May. Europe's largest economy reported its first monthly trade deficit in 3 decades after exports fell unexpectedly in May. The German economy is heavily focused on exports. Let's now tell you that holidaymakers in the United Kingdom should brace for even more travel chaos in the coming days, as airlines have been given a green light to cancel flights this summer without incurring any fines. Airlines are expected to announce a fresh wave of cancellations over the summer period as the government introduced an airline slot amnesty. Under this plan, airlines will be able to cancel flights without being penalized for not using their airport slot, but must finalize their summer schedule by Friday, July 8th. And less than 3 weeks before embarking on a series of interest rate hikes, the European Central Bank is honing its plans to keep government bond markets from panicking as it does so. A first line of defense against a sovereign debt crisis, akin to the one that struck the Eurozone last decade, has become active. A new instrument to avoid so-called fragmentation, that is, unwarranted blowouts in member states' yields, is due soon to enable the ECB respond to record inflation. China's Vice Premier Liu He has discussed U.S. economic sanctions and tariffs in a call with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen amid reports the Biden administration is close to rolling back some trade levies. The lifting of tariffs and sanctions and the fair treatment of Chinese enterprises are areas of great interest to China. Liu said in a video call with Yellen on Tuesday. The two sides discussed economic policy and stabilizing global supply chains, agreeing that it is significant for the U.S. and China to strengthen communication and coordination in those areas for the benefit of both countries and the rest of the world. And that's all on international business news. But then before we go on a break, let's tell you that we will be looking at how profitable life has been for Kenya and Tanzania since reaching bilateral trade agreements last year. But then that piece could be in jeopardy. So that is going to be our next discussion after this break.